Christine just revealed the heartbreaking truth about her marriage with Kody Brown, and what she said left even fans completely shocked. So stay until the end because this changes everything. And if you love dramatic reality TV stories with shocking twists, hit subscribe right now because you do not want to miss what happens next. Christine sat across from the interviewer with a glow that immediately caught everyone's attention. And before the conversation could even settle into a normal rhythm, she delivered a statement that completely changed the emotional direction of the interview. Because for the first time, she openly admitted that she finally understood what real love actually felt like. And those words instantly created shock among longtime viewers who had spent years watching her complicated marriage to Kody Brown unfold on screen. She explained that after marrying David, she realized she had spent much of her life accepting a version of love that now seemed incomplete. And although she spoke calmly, the emotional weight behind her words was impossible to ignore, because it suggested that the relationship she once defended may have lacked the emotional depth she never knew she was missing. And as she smiled while describing her life now, audiences could feel the contrast between the woman sitting there peacefully talking about romance and the woman they had watched struggle through years of emotional uncertainty. The interview started lightly with stories about New York City and all the fun tourist adventures she and Janelle experienced after arriving early for their appearance. But even in those playful moments, there were hidden emotional details that slowly built suspense. Christine laughed about exploring the city lights, walking through Central Park, and watching David fully enjoy every moment of the trip while she worked. And the way she described him made it clear that this relationship felt effortless, easy, and comforting, unlike the emotional tension fans often saw during earlier seasons of the family series. Then the conversation shifted when the interview asked how married life was going, and suddenly the atmosphere changed completely, because Christine described David not just as a husband, but as a true companion, someone who brought peace into her life instead of stress. And she explained that everything about their relationship felt natural and calm, almost unreal compared to what she experienced before. And viewers could immediately sense that this was more than a simple honeymoon phase, because even Janelle, sitting beside her, looked emotional while describing how much more relaxed and comfortable Christine seemed now. And that observation became one of the most revealing moments of the entire conversation, because it quietly
She had no idea how intense things had become behind closed doors, because Janelle never fully revealed the details at the time. And hearing Christine describe her shock while watching the argument unfold added another layer of mystery to the family dynamics, because it suggested there were many emotional moments hidden from even the people closest to each other. Janelle calmly admitted that the fight was probably the worst argument she and Kody had ever experienced. And then she made a confession that stunned viewers even more, because instead of feeling devastated after the fight, she felt relieved. And that single word completely changed the emotional tone of the interview. She explained that after the argument ended, she sat in silence for hours, processing everything, before finally realizing that the relationship might already be emotionally over. And the relief she experienced felt like a burden lifting from her shoulders. And audiences watching could sense how emotionally exhausted she must have been long before the separation became official. Then came one of the most controversial parts of the discussion, because the interviewer brought up Kody's later comments suggesting that some of his relationships lacked genuine love, and that he had only truly been in love with Robyn. And instantly, the atmosphere shifted again, because both women clearly disagreed with that version of events. Christine responded carefully, explaining that while everyone has their own perspective, she believed the family they built together was real, meaningful, and based on genuine effort. She reminded viewers that they raised children together, supported each other through difficult times, and spent years building a family structure that worked in many ways, and she rejected the idea that everything had simply been an act. However, she also admitted something deeply emotional, because while she defended the reality of their shared life, she now understood that what she experienced with David felt completely different from anything she knew before. And that realization forced her to look back at the past with new understanding. She explained that now she finally knows what it feels like to truly be in love and truly feel loved in return. And that emotional awakening made her realize that some important pieces were missing in her previous marriage, even though she never recognized it at the time. And viewers could feel the heartbreak hidden inside that realization, because it suggested she spent years emotionally settling without even realizing it. Meanwhile, Janelle approached the subject from a different angle, focusing more on the practical success of the family rather
And respectful. She admitted there was no active friendship remaining, and those calm responses carried enormous emotional weight because they showed how years of tension and emotional distance slowly transformed a once united family into separate emotional worlds, existing side by side without real connection. And perhaps the most emotional topic arrived near the end, when the discussion shifted toward the children and their relationships with Kody. Because despite all the family conflict, both women still expressed hope that healing might eventually happen. Christine explained that some relationships between Kody and the children were improving, while others remained difficult and painful. But she continued encouraging communication whenever possible, even arranging visits between Kody and their daughter Truly. Because regardless of her personal feelings, she still wanted her children to have opportunities to maintain a connection with their father. Meanwhile, Janelle admitted that some of her sons still had very strained relationships with Kody, and that very little progress had been made so far. But even then, she expressed hope that time could eventually soften the tension, because she understood how deeply parental conflict can affect children emotionally. And as the interview slowly approached its ending, viewers were left with a powerful emotional contradiction. Because although Christine and Janelle both appeared happier, calmer, and more emotionally free than they had in years, there were still visible scars from the past and unresolved questions hanging over the future of the family. And perhaps that lingering uncertainty is what made the conversation feel so dramatic. Because even while discussing healing, happiness, and personal growth, there remained an undeniable feeling that the story was not fully finished yet, and that more emotional truths may still be waiting to surface in the future. As the interview continued, the emotional atmosphere became even more intense, because beneath every calm smile and respectful answer, there were quiet hints of heartbreak, disappointment, and years of emotional sacrifice that viewers were only now beginning to fully understand. And what made the conversation so gripping was the fact that neither Christine nor Janelle spoke with bitterness or anger. Instead, they reflected on their past with surprising honesty and maturity, which somehow made every revelation feel even more dramatic, because audiences could sense that these were not emotional reactions happening in the heat of the moment. These were reflections coming from women who had spent months reevaluating their lives after walking away from a family structure that once defined their entire identity. Christine leaned back while talking about her past, almost as if she was revisiting another lifetime, and she compared the experience to reading a book that once felt meaningful but no longer represented who she had become. She explained that there were many good memories and moments she would always treasure, especially involving the children, but she also admitted that she would never go back. And that statement carried a quiet finality that felt impossible to ignore, because it sounded like someone who had finally made peace with leaving behind a life she once fought desperately to protect. And while she spoke softly, viewers could still feel the emotional impact behind her words, especially when she described how different her life felt now with David. She repeatedly emphasized how easy and natural their relationship seemed, and every time she smiled while talking about him, the contrast with her previous marriage became more obvious, without her even needing to directly criticize anyone. She described simple moments like traveling together, walking through the city, or sharing quiet conversations, as if those ordinary experiences now carried extraordinary emotional meaning, because for the first time, she felt emotionally secure and truly appreciated. And audiences watching could not help but wonder how many years she spent quietly longing for that kind of connection, without fully realizing it. Then the conversation returned to the painful subject of Kody's comments regarding love and marriage. Comments that shocked not only the viewers, but also the women sitting in the interview, because Kody had implied that he was never fully in love with several of his wives, and that his deepest connection had always been with Robin Brown.
And hearing that perspective publicly seemed to reopen emotional wounds that had never completely healed. Christine responded carefully, but could sense that some relationships may never fully return to what they once were. Then the interview turned toward perhaps the most painful subject of all, the children and their relationships with Kody. Because despite all the emotional hurt, both Christine and Janelle continued prioritizing reconciliation and healing for the sake of their kids. Christine explained that some relationships between Kody and the children had improved, while others remained distant, complicated, or emotionally strained. But she continued encouraging contact whenever possible, even helping arrange visits between Kody and their daughter Truly. Because regardless of everything that happened between the adults, she still believed children deserved opportunities to maintain healthy relationships with their father. And that statement revealed another layer of emotional maturity. Because despite her own pain, she refused to stand in the way of potential healing. Meanwhile, Janelle admitted that some of her sons still had very little communication with Kody, and that progress had been slow. But she also expressed hope that time could eventually soften the tension, because she understood how deeply unresolved parental conflict can affect children emotionally, even long after arguments fade away. And perhaps one of the saddest parts of the conversation came when both women acknowledged that many of the children still loved their father and wanted healthier relationships with him, despite everything that happened. Because underneath all the public drama, there remained a family still trying to navigate complicated emotional realities. And viewers could feel the sadness in that truth. Because no matter how broken adult relationships become, the emotional impact on children often lasts far longer than anyone expects. Then another surprising emotional detail emerged when Christine described how Kody usually texts her before coming into town to visit Truly. And she calmly explains that she continues cooperating with those visits because she wants her daughter to maintain that connection. And although the interaction sounded respectful, there was still an emotional tension underneath it, because audiences remembered how painful many of the family conflicts had become in previous seasons. And yet, despite everything, both women consistently returned to the same theme throughout the interview: hope. Hope that relationships could improve, hope that the children would eventually find peace, and hope that time might slowly heal emotional wounds that once seemed impossible to repair. But even while speaking positively, there remained a noticeable sense of uncertainty, because neither woman could fully predict what the future of the family would look like. And perhaps that uncertainty is what kept viewers emotionally invested in every moment of the interview. Because despite the calm smiles and mature reflections, there were still unresolved questions hanging over everything. Questions about whether true reconciliation was possible, whether old wounds could ever completely disappear, and whether the emotional damage caused by years of conflict could truly be undone. Then, as the conversation slowly approached its conclusion, the emotional complexity of the entire situation became impossible to ignore. Because on one hand, Christine and Janelle appeared happier, calmer, and more emotionally grounded than they had in years. Yet, on the other hand, the scars left behind by the collapse of the family were still clearly visible beneath the surface. And that contradiction made the interview feel deeply human. Because life rarely provides clean endings. Sometimes people move forward while still carrying unresolved emotions, memories, and complicated relationships that never fully disappear. And perhaps that is why this conversation resonated so strongly with audiences. Because it was not simply about reality television drama. It was about people reevaluating decades of their lives, trying to understand where things went wrong, and discovering entirely new versions of themselves after years of a moral compromise. And as viewers watched Christine speak confidently about finally understanding love, and watched Janelle describe finding peace after years of emotional exhaustion. After everything Christine and Janelle revealed, one thing is clear. The Brown family story is far from over, and the next chapter could change everything again. So if you want the latest shocking updates and emotional reality TV drama, make sure you subscribe now, because the biggest revelations are still coming.